Sophie Martinez wiped down table 7 for the third time that evening, her hands trembling not from exhaustion but from the fury still burning in her chest. The man in the expensive suit had just walked out, leaving behind a scene of chaos that would cost her everything she'd worked for. What she didn't know was that this same man would be calling her tomorrow with an offer that would transform her life forever. She had no idea that her moment of courage would be worth 7 figures, or that standing up for what's right would lead to the biggest opportunity of her lifetime. But as she stared at her manager's red face and heard the words, "You're fired," one question remained. Could a single act of defiance change everything? Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The Golden Spoon restaurant buzzed with its usual Tuesday evening energy, the clatter of silverware mixing with conversations that ranged from business deals to first dates. Sophie Martinez moved between the tables with practiced efficiency, her black uniform crisp despite being 4 hours into her shift. At 26, she had been waiting tables for 8 years, ever since dropping out of community college, when her mother's medical bills started piling up. The Golden Spoon wasn't the fanciest establishment in downtown Portland, but it attracted a steady stream of professionals and tourists who appreciated good food without pretentious service. Sophie had learned to read her customers within moments of seating them. The businessman checking his phone every 30 seconds needed fast service and minimal conversation. The elderly couple sharing a dessert wanted attention and stories about the menu. The young mother with 2 restless children required patience and extra napkins. It was a skill that had served her well, helping her earn tips that kept her small apartment and supported her mother's medications. Tonight felt different somehow, charged with an energy she couldn't quite place. The restaurant was busier than usual for a Tuesday, and she found herself moving faster between her 6 tables, balancing plates and refilling coffee cups, while mentally calculating tips and bill totals. Her rent was due in 3 days, and she was still $50 short, even after picking up extra shifts the previous weekend. Marcus Chen, her manager, caught her eye from behind the bar where he was polishing glasses. At 42, Marcus had worked his way up from busboy to manager over 15 years, and Sophie respected his fair treatment of staff. He nodded toward table 12, where a new customer had just been seated. Sophie grabbed a menu and water glass, smoothing her apron as she approached. The man at table 12 commanded attention without trying. He appeared to be in his early 50s, with silver-streaked dark hair and sharp features that spoke of either good genetics or expensive grooming. His charcoal suit was clearly tailored, and the watch on his wrist caught the light in a way that suggested precious metals. But it was his eyes that made Sophie pause, dark and calculating, as if he were constantly evaluating everything around him. "Good evening, welcome to the Golden Spoon," Sophie said, setting down the water glass and menu with practiced smoothness. "My name is Sophie, and I'll be taking care of you tonight. Can I start you off with something to drink besides water?" The man barely glanced up from his phone. "Coffee. Black. And I already know what I want to eat, so don't waste my time with specials." His voice carried the crisp authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Sophie felt her smile tighten slightly, but maintained her professional demeanor. "Of course, sir. What can I get for you?" "The ribeye, medium rare, with the loaded potato. And make sure the kitchen doesn't screw it up. I don't have time for sending food back." He thrust the menu at her without looking up from his phone. "Absolutely, sir. That'll be right out." Sophie took the menu and headed toward the kitchen, passing table 9, where Jenny Rodriguez was serving an elderly couple their dessert. Jenny was new, just 3 weeks on the job, and still nervous around demanding customers. At 19, she was putting herself through community college and working every shift she could get. Sophie placed the order with Diego, the head cook, and returned with the coffee. The man was now on a phone call, speaking in clipped tones about stock prices and acquisition deals. She set the coffee down carefully, trying not to interrupt, but he held up a finger in an irritated gesture that made her pause. "I don't care what the board thinks," he was saying into his phone. "If they can't see the potential in the Portland market, then they're not thinking big enough. Sometimes you have to test people before you invest in them." He ended the call and finally looked directly at Sophie for the first time. "How long for the steak?" "Diego estimated about 15 minutes, sir." Is there anything else I can get you while you wait? Just make sure it's done right. I've had enough incompetence today. He returned to his phone, dismissing her with his attention. Sophie moved through her other tables, checking on the businessman who needed his check, refilling iced tea for the young mother, and chatting briefly with the elderly couple about their upcoming anniversary. The rhythm of service usually calmed her, but something about the man at table 12 kept drawing her attention. There was an intensity to him that felt almost predatory, as if he were hunting for something. When Diego rang the bell for table 12, Sophie carefully inspected the plate. The ribeye looked perfect, seared to a beautiful medium rare, with grill marks that would make any food photographer proud. The loaded potato was steaming, topped with cheese, bacon bits, and chives exactly as advertised on the menu. She carried it over with confidence. Here we are, sir. One ribeye medium rare with loaded potato. She set the plate down with a flourish, genuinely proud of how appetizing it looked. The man cut into the steak immediately, not bothering to thank her or acknowledge the presentation. Sophie waited a moment to ensure everything was to his satisfaction, but he was already chewing with a deeply skeptical expression. This is overcooked, he announced loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. I specifically said medium rare, and this is clearly medium. Do you people not understand basic cooking terminology? Sophie looked at the steak, which was clearly pink in the center with just the right amount of red. She had been serving steaks for years, and could judge doneness at a glance. Sir, I can see the pink center from here. That appears to be a perfect medium rare to me, but if you'd prefer it cooked less, I'm happy to have Diego adjust it. Don't tell me what I'm looking at, the man snapped, his voice rising. I know the difference between medium rare and medium, and this is overcooked. I want a new steak, and I want it now. Several nearby tables had stopped their conversations to watch the exchange. Sophie felt heat creeping up her neck but maintained her composure. Of course, sir. Let me take this back and have Diego prepare a new one. I apologize for any inconvenience. As she reached for the plate, the man grabbed her wrist. And I'm not paying for this one. When you mess up an order, the customer shouldn't have to pay for your mistakes. Sophie gently extracted her wrist from his grip, her professional mask beginning to slip. I understand your frustration, sir. Let me speak with my manager about the bill while Diego prepares your new steak. You do that, and next time, maybe pay attention when a customer gives you specific instructions. Sophie carried the plate back to the kitchen, her hands shaking slightly with controlled anger. The steak was perfectly cooked, exactly as ordered, and she knew it. Diego looked up from the grill where he was preparing orders for other tables. What's wrong with it? He asked, examining the returned plate. Customer says it's overcooked. Says he ordered medium rare. Diego cut into the steak and shook his head. This is textbook medium rare, Sophie. Pink center, warm red throughout. I've been cooking steaks for 12 years. I know, but the customer is always right, even when they're wrong. Sophie sighed. Can you throw another one on? And maybe cook this one a little less, just to be safe. Sure thing. Give me about 12 minutes. Sophie found Marcus restocking wine behind the bar. I need to talk to you about table 12. The customer is claiming his medium rare steak is overcooked and wants it comped. Marcus looked over at the man, who was now loudly complaining to someone on his phone about incompetent restaurant staff. What do you think? Is it overcooked? No. Diego and I both looked at it. It's perfect medium rare. But he's making a scene and wants a new steak plus the meal comped. Marcus rubbed his temples. Okay, we'll comp the steak but not the whole meal. Sometimes you have to pick your battles, especially when they're this loud about it. Sophie nodded and returned to her other tables while the new steak cooked. The businessman needed change for a 50, the elderly couple wanted to hear about tomorrow's lunch specials, and the young mother was trying to convince her toddler to eat vegetables instead of throwing them on the floor. Normal restaurant chaos that usually energized her. When the second steak was ready, Sophie inspected it carefully. This one was definitely on the rare side of medium rare, almost too red for most people's taste. She carried it over to table 12, with renewed hope that this would satisfy the difficult customer. Here's your new steak, sir. Diego cooked this one a bit less to ensure it meets your preferences. The man cut into it immediately, and Sophie could see the deep red center even from her position beside the table. He took a bite, chewed thoughtfully, and then set down his fork with theatrical frustration. Now it's undercooked. This is practically raw in the middle. How hard is it to cook a steak properly? Sophie felt her composure beginning to crack. The first steak had been perfect, exactly as ordered. This one was clearly rare, which should have satisfied someone who claimed the first was overcooked. There was no pleasing this customer, and she was beginning to suspect that was the point. "I apologize again, sir. Would you like me to have Diego cook it a bit more? We want to make sure you're completely satisfied." At this point, I've lost my appetite. This is exactly the kind of incompetent service that's ruining the restaurant industry. You can't follow simple instructions. Your kitchen can't cook a basic steak, and now you've wasted 40 minutes of my time. The man's voice had risen to the point where most of the restaurant was now watching the confrontation. Sophie was acutely aware of her other tables waiting for service, of Marcus watching from behind the bar, and of the general discomfort settling over the dining room. "Sir, I understand your frustration, but we've tried to accommodate your preferences twice now. Perhaps—" "Don't tell me what I should or shouldn't be frustrated about," he interrupted. "I'm not paying for any of this garbage, and I want to speak to your manager immediately." Sophie took a deep breath, trying to channel 8 years of customer service experience. "Of course, sir. Let me get Marcus for you right away." As she turned to leave, she heard the man mutter under his breath, "Probably didn't even graduate high school. What can you expect from people like that?" The words hit Sophie like a physical blow. She had worked 2 jobs to help support her family since she was 18. She had sacrificed her college education to pay for her mother's cancer treatments. She showed up every day, worked hard, treated customers with respect, and took pride in doing her job well. The assumption that she was somehow lesser because she waited tables ignited a fury she had kept carefully controlled for years. But it was what happened next that pushed her over the edge. The man had apparently decided he needed to use the restroom while waiting for the manager. As he stood to lead the table, Jenny Rodriguez approached with a coffee pot, offering refills to nearby customers. She was focused on pouring coffee for table 11 and didn't notice the man stepping backward from his chair. They collided gently, and a small splash of coffee landed on the man's suit jacket. It was clearly an accident, the kind of minor mishap that happened in busy restaurants every day. Jenny immediately set down the coffee pot and began apologizing profusely. "Oh my gosh! I'm so sorry, sir. Let me get you some napkins and soda water. We can get that right out, you clumsy idiot." The man exploded, his voice echoing through the now silent restaurant. "Look what you've done. This jacket costs more than you make in a month." Jenny's eyes filled with tears as she continued trying to help. "I'm really sorry, sir. It was an accident. Please, let me—" "An accident. You people need to learn to watch where you're going. First, the waitress can't take a simple order. Now you're throwing coffee on customers. What kind of place is this?" Sophie watched Jenny's face crumble under the verbal assault. The 19-year-old was doing her best in a difficult job, working to pay for school, and didn't deserve this public humiliation. Something inside Sophie snapped, and 8 years of swallowed pride and absorbed abuse finally found its voice. "That's enough," Sophie said, stepping between Jenny and the angry customer. "It was clearly an accident, and she's trying to help fix it. There's no need to speak to her that way." The man turned his fury on Sophie. "Excuse me? Did I ask for your opinion?" "No, but I'm giving it anyway. Jenny is a good employee and a hard worker. Accidents happen in restaurants, and screaming at teenage girls isn't going to solve anything. I don't care how hard she works if she can't do her job properly. And I certainly don't need lectures from someone who can't tell the difference between medium rare and medium." Sophie felt her anger crystallizing into something cold and focused. Both of those steaks were cooked exactly as you ordered them. The first one was perfect medium rare, and the second was actually undercooked because you complained. You're not upset about the food or the coffee. You're upset because you can't intimidate us into giving you a free meal and entertainment. And the restaurant had gone completely silent, except for the soft jazz playing over the sound system. Every customer and staff member was watching the confrontation unfold. Sophie knew she was crossing a line that might cost her job, but Jenny's tears and years of similar encounters had pushed her past caring about consequences. "How dare you speak to me that way?" the man said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Do you have any idea who I am?" "I don't care who you are," Sophie replied, matching his tone. "Rich, poor, famous, or unknown, everybody deserves to be treated with basic respect, and everybody owes other people that same respect. You've been rude from the moment you sat down, you've complained about perfectly good food, and now you're making a teenager cry over an accident. Money doesn't give you the right to treat people like they're less than human." "I want her fired," the man said, pointing directly at Sophie. "Right now. I will not be spoken to this way by the help." Marcus had approached during the exchange, clearly torn between supporting his employee and avoiding a bigger scene. "Sir, I apologize for the situation. Let's step over here and discuss this calmly." "There's nothing to discuss. Either she goes, or I call the health department, the Better Business Bureau, and every review site on the internet. I have connections in this city, and I can make sure this place never recovers." Sophie looked at Marcus and saw the defeat in his eyes. She knew the math as well as he did. One difficult customer could damage the restaurant's reputation for months, especially if he followed through on his threats. She was just one waitress out of dozens in the city. The Golden Spoon employed 15 people who depended on their jobs. "It's okay, Marcus," Sophie said quietly, untying her apron. "I understand." "Sophie, wait," Marcus started, but she shook her head. "No, it's fine. I won't let this man hurt the restaurant or anyone else's job because of me." She folded her apron neatly and set it on the nearest table. "Jenny, you didn't do anything wrong. Don't let anyone tell you different." She walked toward the back to collect a purse from the employee break room, her head held high despite the burning shame in her chest. 8 years of building relationships with regular customers, of taking pride in excellent service, of supporting her family through tips and steady wages, ended because she couldn't watch a teenage girl be humiliated without speaking up. As she passed the man on her way out, he leaned close enough that only she could hear. "That's what happens when you don't know your place," he said with cold satisfaction. Sophie stopped and looked directly into his eyes. "My place is standing up for people who can't stand up for themselves. If that's wrong, then I'd rather be wrong and unemployed than right and cowardly." She walked out of the Golden Spoon into the cool Portland evening, her hands shaking with adrenaline and suppressed emotion. The streetlights cast long shadows as she made her way to the bus stop, processing what had just happened. She had lost her job, her income, her insurance, and her ability to help with her mother's medical expenses, all because she couldn't watch an innocent person be abused without intervention. The bus ride home gave her 23 minutes to cycle through anger, regret, fear, and a strange sense of pride that she couldn't quite shake. She had done the right thing, even if it cost her everything. That had to count for something, even if it wouldn't pay rent or buy groceries. Her apartment was a small one-bedroom in a building that had seen better decades, but she had made it home with second-hand furniture and plants that thrived despite limited sunlight. She kicked off her work shoes and sat heavily on her threadbare couch, finally allowing the tears to come. She cried for the job she had lost, for Jenny's frightened face, for the unfairness of a world where money could buy the right to treat people terribly. She cried for her mother, who would worry about the medical bills, and for herself, facing an uncertain future at 26, with nothing but pride and principles to show for her stand. Her phone buzzed with a text from Jenny. "Thank you for standing up for me. I'm sorry you got fired. You're the best person I know." More texts followed from other coworkers who had heard what happened. Diego sent a message saying the steaks had been perfectly cooked. Marcus texted an apology and offered to serve as a reference. Even some customers had asked for her contact information to provide positive recommendations for future employers. Sophie made herself a cup of tea and sat by her window, looking out at the city lights and thinking about what came next. She had some savings, enough for maybe 6 weeks of expenses if she was careful. Her mother's next treatment was scheduled for the following month, and they had been counting on Sophie's insurance to help cover the costs. She would start looking for new work in the morning, but the restaurant industry was small in Portland, and word traveled fast. The story of a waitress arguing with a customer and getting fired might make her unemployable in the service sector, especially if the man followed through on his threats to damage the Golden Spoon's reputation. The irony wasn't lost on her that standing up for someone else might have cost her the ability to stand up for her own family. But as she replayed the evening's events, she couldn't find a moment where she would have acted differently. Some things mattered more than job security. Sophie fell asleep on the couch that night, emotionally exhausted but strangely at peace with her decision. She had no way of knowing that across the city, in a penthouse office overlooking the Columbia River, the man from Table 12 was having a very different kind of evening. Alexander Winters set down his phone after ending a call with his assistant and poured himself 2 fingers of aged scotch. At 51, he had built a restaurant empire from a single food truck into a national chain worth over $2 billion. The Winters Restaurant Group owned everything from casual dining establishments to Michelin-starred fine dining experiences in 12 major cities. But success had brought an unexpected problem. It had become nearly impossible to evaluate the true character of employees and business partners. Everyone knew who he was, everyone wanted something from him, and everyone told him exactly what they thought he wanted to hear. Genuine reactions, honest feedback, and authentic human connection had become rare commodities in his world. So he had developed an unusual habit of going undercover to his own establishments and to competitors, creating difficult situations to see how staff handled pressure, conflict, and moral dilemmas. He had learned more about human nature in anonymous restaurant booths than in 1,000 boardroom meetings. Tonight's visit to the Golden Spoon was supposed to be reconnaissance for a potential acquisition. The restaurant had good numbers, decent reviews, and a location that fit his expansion plans for the Pacific Northwest. He had expected to observe service standards, food quality, and staff competency under stress. He had not expected to encounter someone like Sophie Martinez. Alexander had created hundreds of difficult scenarios over the years, playing the part of the demanding customer, the unreasonable client, the impossible to-please patron. Most servers either crumbled under pressure, became defensive and argumentative, or simply gave him whatever he wanted to make him go away. He had seen everything from tears to tantrums to elaborate attempts at flattery and bribery. But he had never seen someone sacrifice their own job to defend a coworker. Sophie had known exactly what her words would cost her, had seen the choice between employment and integrity, and had chosen integrity without hesitation. She had stood up to him not because she thought she could win, but because she thought it was right. In his experience, that kind of moral courage was rarer than business genius and more valuable than advanced degrees. The restaurant industry, like most service industries, often ground down people's spirits until they learned to absorb abuse as part of the job description. Finding someone who refused to be ground down, who maintained compassion for others even under personal attack, was extraordinary. Alexander opened his laptop and began researching Sophie Martinez. Social media profiles showed a young woman who volunteered at a local animal shelter, who posted pictures with an older woman who was clearly her mother, who shared articles about workers' rights and community, college success stories. Public records indicated she had been steadily employed for years, had no criminal history, and lived modestly in a neighborhood that suggested financial responsibility rather than wealth. More importantly, her reaction to his manufactured crisis had been authentic and immediate. She hadn't calculated the cost-benefit analysis of intervention, hadn't paused to consider her own interests, hadn't tried to find a middle ground that would keep everyone happy. She had simply seen someone being hurt and had acted to stop it. That kind of instinctive leadership was exactly what Alexander looked for when promoting managers within his organization. Technical skills could be taught, experience could be gained, but character was either present or absent. Sophie had demonstrated character under fire, which was the most reliable predictor of future behavior he had found. He picked up his phone and called his assistant, Catherine Mills, who managed his schedule and handled sensitive communications even at 10:30 at night. "Catherine, I need you to locate employment information for someone named Sophie Martinez. She works, or worked as of tonight, at the Golden Spoon restaurant on Northwest 23rd Avenue. I need her contact information and a complete background check by tomorrow morning." Of course, Mr. Winters. Should I prepare a standard employment packet? No, this is different. I'll explain tomorrow. Also, clear my schedule for Thursday afternoon. I think I'm going to make someone an offer they won't expect. Alexander finished his scotch and looked out at the city lights, thinking about the restaurant empire he had built and the legacy he wanted to leave. He had always believed that great restaurants were built on great people, not just great food. Finding great people, however, had proven increasingly difficult as his profile had grown. Tonight had reminded him why he had fallen in love with the restaurant business in the first place. It wasn't about profit margins or market share, though those were important. It was about creating spaces where people could come together, where service was an art form, where both customers and employees could experience dignity and connection. Sophie Martinez had shown him what that looked like in practice. Tomorrow, he would show her what it could mean for her future. Sophie woke the next morning to sunlight streaming through her apartment window and the immediate, crushing memory of the previous evening. For a moment, lying in her bed, she could pretend it had been a bad dream. Then she saw her work clothes draped over the chair where she had thrown them in exhaustion, and reality settled back into place. She made coffee with hands that only trembled slightly, and began the practical work of unemployment. Her laptop was old and slow, but it connected to the internet well enough for job searches. She updated her resume, highlighting her 8 years of restaurant experience and the customer service awards she had received at previous positions. The Portland job market for servers was competitive but steady. The city's thriving food scene meant there were always openings, though the best positions at upscale restaurants usually went to people with connections or formal culinary training. She would probably end up at another mid-level establishment, making slightly less money while rebuilding her reputation and relationships. Her phone rang at 11:15, displaying a number she didn't recognize. Probably a telemarketer, but she answered anyway, in case it was a potential employer calling about an online application. "Hello, is this Sophie Martinez?" The voice was crisp, professional, and female. "Yes, this is Sophie. Ms. Martinez, my name is Catherine Mills. I represent a business interest that would like to discuss a potential opportunity with you. Would you be available for a meeting this afternoon?" Sophie sat up straighter, suddenly alert. "I'm sorry, could you be more specific? What kind of business interest? I understand you worked at the Golden Spoon restaurant until last evening. My employer was present during the incident that led to your departure and was impressed by your conduct. He would like to discuss a business proposition with you." Sophie's blood ran cold. The man from table 12 had tracked her down. He was going to sue her, or press charges, or make sure she never worked in Portland again. She should have known that someone with his obvious wealth and connections wouldn't simply walk away after being challenged publicly. "Ms. Martinez, are you still there?" "I'm here. Look, I don't know what your employer told you, but I was defending a coworker who didn't deserve to be treated badly. I'm not going to apologize for that, and I'm not interested in any kind of legal action or Ms. Martinez," Catherine interrupted gently. "I think there may be some confusion. This isn't about legal action. My employer would like to offer you a job." Sophie nearly dropped the phone. "I'm sorry, what?" "A job. Specifically, a management position with significant growth potential and equity participation. Would you be available to meet at 2 o'clock this afternoon to discuss the details?" Sophie's mind raced through possibilities, each more unlikely than the last. "Who is your employer exactly? I'd prefer to let him explain the situation in person. Can you meet us at the Heathman Hotel downtown? The Rose Room on the mezzanine level?" The Heathman Hotel was one of Portland's most prestigious establishments, the kind of place where Sophie had never set foot as anything other than a curious observer walking past on the sidewalk. Whatever this was about, it was serious enough to warrant a meeting in a 5-star hotel. "I'll be there," Sophie said, already mentally sorting through her limited wardrobe for something appropriate. "Excellent. Ask for the private dining room reserved under Mills. I'll see you at 2. Sophie spent the next 2 hours getting ready with the kind of care usually reserved for job interviews or court appearances. She chose her best dress, a simple black sheath she had bought for her high school graduation and had worn to every important occasion since, It was still elegant, though several years out of style. And she paired it with her only good shoes and the pearl earrings her grandmother had left her. The bus ride downtown gave her time to run through scenarios, each more bizarre than the last. Maybe the man from the restaurant felt guilty about getting her fired and wanted to offer her money to avoid negative publicity. Maybe he had been testing her for some reason and she had passed. Maybe this was an elaborate setup for some kind of humiliation or revenge. The Heathman Hotel lobby was everything Sophie had imagined and more. With marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and the kind of understated luxury that whispered rather than shouted about money. She felt conspicuously out of place, but approached the concierge desk with as much confidence as ease. She could manage. "I'm here for a meeting in the Rose Room, reserved under Mills." The concierge, a perfectly groomed woman in her 40s, smiled warmly. "Of course, Ms. Martinez. Take the elevator to the mezzanine level and turn left. Ms. Mills is expecting you." The Rose Room was a private dining space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city and furnishings that probably cost more than Sophie's annual rent. A woman in her 30s with auburn hair and an expensive suit stood as Sophie entered. "Ms. Martinez, I'm Catherine Mills. Thank you for coming on such short notice." They shook hands, and Catherine gestured to a seating area with leather chairs arranged around a coffee table set with fine china and what appeared to be gourmet pastries. "Please, have a seat. My employer will be joining us momentarily. Can I offer you coffee or tea?" "Coffee would be great, thank you." Sophie accepted a delicate cup that probably cost more than she had made in tips on a good night. The door opened, and Sophie's worst fears were confirmed as the man from table 12 entered the room. He was dressed more casually today, in dark jeans and a button-down shirt. But there was no mistaking the sharp features and calculating eyes that had watched her lose her job the night before. Sophie set down her coffee cup and started to stand. "I think there's been some kind of mistake. I'm not interested in whatever game this is." "Please," the man said, raising his hand in a gesture of peace. "I know this must be confusing, but I'd like to explain. I'm Alexander Winters, and I owe you an apology." Sophie remained standing, her body tense with fight-or-flight instincts. The name was familiar, though she couldn't immediately place it. "Mr. Winters owns the Winters Restaurant Group," Catherine explained. "Perhaps you've heard of Harvest Moon, the Copper Kettle, or Seasons?" Sophie had indeed heard of those restaurants. Everyone in the service industry knew about Winters Restaurant Group, a national chain of upscale establishments, known for excellent food, innovative concepts, and employee benefits that were legendary in an industry notorious for low wages and poor treatment. "You own Winters Restaurant Group?" Sophie asked, finally sitting back down. "I do. And last night, I was conducting what we call an integrity assessment at the Golden Spoon. We're considering acquiring the restaurant, and I wanted to observe how the staff handled difficult situations." Sophie felt anger flaring again. "So you deliberately created a scene to test us? You made Jenny cry and got me fired as some kind of experiment?" "I did," Alexander said simply. "And I deeply regret the pain I caused both of you. What I saw in you last night, however, was extraordinary. What you saw was someone standing up for a teenager being bullied by a man who could afford to be decent but chose not to be." "Exactly. Do you know how rare that is? I've conducted similar assessments at over 100 establishments in the past 5 years. I've seen servers cry, managers cave to unreasonable demands, and employees throw each other under the bus to avoid confrontation. I have never seen someone sacrifice their own job to defend a coworker." Sophie crossed her arms. "So, this is what? Some kind of reward for passing your secret test? You get me fired, and then offer me a job like that makes it okay?" Alexander leaned forward, his expression serious. "What I'm offering you is much more than a job, Sophie. I'd like you to become my business partner." The words hung in the air like something from a dream that made no sense upon waking. Sophie stared at Alexander, then at Catherine, looking for signs that this was some elaborate joke. "I'm sorry, you're what?" "My business partner. I'm opening a new restaurant concept here in Portland. Something different from our existing properties. I need someone to help develop it, manage it, and eventually own a significant stake in it. Based on what I witnessed last night, I think you could be that person. Sophie's mind struggled to process the offer. Less than 24 hours ago, she had been a waitress living paycheck to paycheck. Now a billionaire was offering her a partnership in a restaurant venture. I don't understand. I don't have any management experience. I never finished college. I don't have money to invest. What could I possibly bring to a partnership with someone like you? Catherine opened a leather portfolio and slid a document across the table. These are the preliminary terms we'd like to propose. Please take a look. Sophie picked up the papers with trembling hands. The first page outlined a position as general manager and partner in a new restaurant concept, with a starting salary that was 3 times what she had been making at the Golden Spoon. The second page detailed profit-sharing arrangements and equity stakes that would make her a millionaire if the restaurant succeeded. This doesn't make sense, Sophie said, looking up from the papers. Why me? You could hire any experienced restaurant manager in the country. Experience can be taught, Alexander replied. Character cannot. What you demonstrated last night, that instinctive protection of someone vulnerable, that willingness to sacrifice your own interests for principle, that's what great leaders are made of. I can teach you financial management, menu development, staff scheduling, and inventory control. I cannot teach you to care about people the way you obviously do. Sophie looked at the numbers again, trying to make them feel real. What exactly would this new restaurant be? Alexander's eyes lit up with genuine enthusiasm. Something Portland has never seen before. A fine dining establishment where every employee, from dishwashers to servers, earns a living wage with full benefits and profit sharing. Where customer service means creating experiences that honor both guests and staff. Where the community comes first and profit follows from doing things right. That sounds too good to be true. It sounds expensive and risky, Catherine added with a smile. Which is why Alexander needs a partner who shares his vision and has demonstrated commitment to those values under pressure. Sophie set the papers down and looked directly at Alexander. Last night you were cruel to Jenny and dismissive of me. You made assumptions about my education and background. And you used your power to intimidate people who couldn't fight back. Why should I believe you actually care about treating employees well? Alexander nodded, accepting the criticism. Because you're absolutely right to question my motives. The person you met last night was a character I created to test reactions under stress. It's not who I am, but it is who I can become when I'm not careful. Success can insulate you from the consequences of your behavior, and wealth can make you forget what it feels like to be powerless. You reminded me of both. He stood and walked to the window overlooking the city. I started with one food truck 23 years ago, working 16-hour days and sleeping in the back. I remember what it felt like to depend on tips for rent money, to smile at difficult customers because I couldn't afford to lose a job, to be treated like I was invisible or disposable. But somewhere along the way, I stopped remembering. I stopped seeing service workers as people with their own stories and struggles. End quote. Sophie watched his reflection in the window, trying to reconcile this thoughtful man with the aggressive customer from the night before. So you create fake emergencies to remind yourself? I create situations to find people who haven't forgotten. People who still see human dignity as non-negotiable, even when it costs them. Personally, people like you, Catherine cleared her throat gently. Perhaps it would help if Sophie understood the scope of what we're proposing. Alexander returned to his seat, pulling out his phone to show Sophie a series of architectural renderings. The location is a converted warehouse in the Pearl District, 12,000 square feet, with an open kitchen, community dining areas, and private event spaces. We want to serve locally sourced, sustainably produced food at prices that are accessible to working families, not just wealthy professionals. Sophie studied the renderings, which showed a warm, inviting space that looked nothing like the sterile elegance of typical upscale establishments. How do you make money serving affordable food with high labor costs? Volume, efficiency, and community investment, Catherine replied. We're not trying to maximize profit per plate. We're trying to create a sustainable model that proves treating people well is good business. Alexander leaned forward. The restaurant industry has a reputation for exploitation because most owners prioritize short-term profits over long-term sustainability. High turnover, low wages, poor working conditions, These things seem cost-effective until you factor in training expenses, quality issues, and reputation damage. We want to prove there's a better way." End quote. Sophie felt a flutter of excitement that she tried to suppress. "And you want me to help prove it?" "I want you to lead it. This would be your restaurant." "Sophie, you'd hire the staff, design the service model, create the culture. I'd provide the capital, the business expertise, and the industry connections, but the day-to-day vision would be yours." The offer was extraordinary, but Sophie couldn't shake her wariness. "What happens if I fail? If the restaurant doesn't work, or I make mistakes, or I'm just not capable of what you're asking? Then we learn from the experience and try something different," Alexander said simply. "The only real failure would be not trying at all. And based on what I observed last night, I don't think you're someone who gives up easily." Sophie looked at the contract again, focusing on the details she had skimmed earlier. The equity arrangement was structured so that her ownership stake would increase over time, eventually reaching 40% if performance targets were met. Even if the restaurant only achieved modest success, she would earn more in 5 years than she could make in 20 as a waitress. "I need time to think about this," she said finally. "This is life-changing money you're talking about, and I want to make sure I understand what I'm getting into." "Of course," Catherine said, sliding a business card across the table. "Take all the time you need. My contact information is there, and I'm available to answer any questions or arrange additional meetings." Alexander stood as Sophie gathered her purse and the contract documents. "Sophie, can I ask you something personal?" She nodded, wary again. "What were you thinking when you decided to stand up to me last night, in that moment when you knew it would cost you your job?" Sophie considered the question, trying to remember her exact thoughts in those heated seconds. "I was thinking that Jenny didn't deserve what was happening to her, and that someone needed to say something. I wasn't really thinking about consequences. I was just thinking about what was right." Alexander smiled, and for the first time since she had met him, it reached his eyes. "That's exactly what I hoped he'd say." The bus ride home gave Sophie 40 minutes to absorb what had happened. She read through the contract twice more, trying to find the hidden clauses or impossible conditions that would make the offer too good to be true. Instead, she found generous terms, reasonable performance expectations, and legal protections that seemed designed to benefit her rather than exploit her. Her apartment felt different when she returned, smaller and shabbier, but also precious in a way it hadn't been that morning. This might be one of the last afternoons she spent here as a struggling waitress, uncertain about rent and groceries. If she accepted Alexander's offer, everything would change. She called her mother, Rosa Martinez, who lived across town in a senior living facility that accepted Medicare patients. Rosa had been battling diabetes and heart disease for 3 years, and the medical expenses had been the primary reason Sophie had never been able to save money or pursue other opportunities. "Mija, you sound different. What's happening?" Sophie told her mother the story, starting with the events at the Golden Spoon and ending with the extraordinary meeting at the Heathman Hotel. Rosa listened without interruption, occasionally making soft sounds of surprise or concern. "This man, this Alexander Winters, you trust him?" "I don't know, Mama. Part of me thinks this is too good to be true, that there must be some catch I'm not seeing. But part of me thinks maybe this is what happens when you do the right thing, even when it's hard. What does your heart tell you?" Sophie closed her eyes, trying to separate her desperate hope from her genuine intuition. "My heart tells me he's serious, and that the restaurant he's describing could actually make a difference. But my head tells me I'm not qualified for something this big." "Your heart is usually smarter than your head, Mija, and you've been taking care of people your whole life. Maybe it's time someone took care of you." After they hung up, Sophie made a list of questions to ask Catherine Mills. She wanted to understand the training process, the timeline for opening, the specific responsibilities she would have, and the support systems that would be available as she learned. She also wanted references from other Winters Restaurant Group employees, particularly managers who had been promoted from entry-level positions. Over the next 3 days, Sophie conducted what amounted to her own due diligence investigation. She researched Alexander Winters online, finding articles about his business philosophy, his company's employee satisfaction ratings, and his reputation within the industry. She visited 3 Waitress Restaurant Group locations in Portland, observing service standards and talking informally with staff members. What she found surprised her. Employees at Waitress establishments consistently reported higher job satisfaction, better wages, and more advancement opportunities than industry standards. Several managers she spoke with had started as servers or kitchen staff and had been promoted based on performance rather than formal education or connections. Catherine Mills arranged for Sophie to have coffee with Maria Gonzalez, who managed the Harvest Moon location in Seattle and had started as a hostess 6 years earlier. Maria's story was remarkably similar to what Alexander was proposing for Sophie, though on a smaller scale. "He doesn't make offers like this lightly," Maria explained as they sat in a downtown coffee shop. "When Alexander sees potential in someone, he invests in it completely. The learning curve is steep, but the support is real. I went from earning minimum wage to a 6-figure salary with profit sharing, and I got there because he believed in me before I believed in myself." End quote. "What's the catch?" Sophie asked. "There has to be something that makes this less perfect than it sounds." Maria laughed. "The catch is that you'll work harder than you've ever worked in your life. Alexander has high standards, and he expects excellence from his partners. You'll make mistakes, and he'll push you to learn from them. You'll face challenges you never imagined, and he'll expect you to find solutions. It's not easy money, Sophie. It's earn money. But it's real? The equity, the partnership, the long-term potential? It's real. Look at my tax returns if you want proof. Alexander Winters changed my life, and I've seen him do the same thing for dozens of other people. The question isn't whether he's serious. The question is whether you're ready to work at a level you've never worked before." Sophie returned home that evening with a decision crystallizing in her mind. She had spent 3 days looking for reasons to say no, for evidence that the offer was too good to be true, or that she wasn't capable of succeeding. Instead, she had found a track record of success, a support system that seemed genuine, and an opportunity that aligned with values she had demonstrated her entire working life. She called Catherine Mills the next morning. "I'd like to accept the offer, but I have some conditions." "I'm listening." "I want a trial period. 6 months where either party can walk away with reasonable notice. I want monthly mentoring sessions with Alexander or another experienced manager, and I want a guarantee that if the restaurant fails, it won't be because we compromised on treating employees well." Catherine was quiet for a moment, presumably taking notes. "Those all sound reasonable. Let me discuss them with Alexander and get back to you by tomorrow. There's one more thing," Sophie added. "I want Jenny Rodriguez to be our first hire. She deserves a chance to work somewhere that values her, and I want to make sure she knows that what happened at the Golden Spoon wasn't her fault." "I'll add that to the list." "Sophie, welcome to Waitress Restaurant Group. I think this is going to be an extraordinary partnership." The next 6 months passed in a blur of activity that challenged every assumption Sophie had made about her own capabilities. Alexander enrolled her in an intensive restaurant management program at the Culinary Institute, where she studied everything from food cost analysis to labor law compliance. She spent weekends visiting Waitress locations in other cities, shadowing experienced managers and learning operational systems. The work was overwhelming at first, requiring her to master concepts she had never encountered and technologies she had barely used. But Catherine had been right about the support system. Alexander met with her weekly, reviewing progress and addressing challenges with patient detail. Other Waitress managers welcomed her into their professional network, sharing resources and offering advice based on their own experiences. Most importantly, Sophie discovered that her instincts about people and service translated surprisingly well to management responsibilities. The empathy that had driven her to defend Jenny helped her understand employee motivations and resolve conflicts. The attention to detail that had made her an excellent waitress served her well in analyzing profit margins and inventory management. The new restaurant, which they decided to call Common Ground, began taking shape in the converted Pearl District warehouse. Sophie worked with architects to to design service flow patterns that would be efficient for staff and welcoming for guests. She collaborated with local farmers and suppliers to create a menu that would be both affordable and exceptional. Most challenging of all, she developed a hiring and training program that would identify people with the right character and teach them the necessary skills. Jenny Rodriguez became the restaurant's first server, enrolled in the same management training program that Sophie had completed. Other hires came from a combination of industry experience and community outreach, with particular attention to candidates who had demonstrated resilience and integrity in difficult circumstances. As the opening date approached, Sophie found herself working 14-hour days, coordinating everything from equipment installation to staff training to marketing strategies. The responsibility was enormous, the pressure constant, but she had never felt more energized or purposeful. 3 weeks before the scheduled opening, Alexander asked Sophie to join him for dinner at Seasons, the flagship Winters restaurant group establishment in downtown Portland. They sat at a quarter table overlooking the Willamette River, sharing a bottle of wine and reflecting on the journey from their confrontation at the Golden Spoon to their partnership at Common Ground. "I have something for you," Alexander said, sliding an envelope across the table. Sophie opened it to find stock certificates representing her initial equity stake in Common Ground, along with a letter from the company's legal team confirming her partnership status. The documents made it official. She was now a business owner, with all the risks and rewards that entailed. "How do you feel?" Alexander asked. Sophie looked out at the city lights reflecting on the river, thinking about the path that had brought her here. Terrified and excited in equal measure. 6 months ago, I was worried about making rent. Now I'm responsible for $1 million restaurant and 15 employees' livelihoods. Any regrets about standing up to that difficult customer? Sophie smiled, remembering the anger and frustration of that night at the Golden Spoon. None at all. If I hadn't been willing to defend Jenny, we never would have met. And even if this partnership hadn't happened, it still would have been the right thing to do. That's what makes you the right partner for this venture, Alexander replied. Success in the restaurant business isn't just about food and service. It's about creating environments where people can thrive. You understood that instinctively, even when it cost you personally. Common Ground opened on a rainy Thursday evening in November, with a soft launch for friends, family, and industry colleagues. Sophie stood in the kitchen, watching the ordered chaos of dinner service, feeling a mixture of pride and anxiety that she suspected would never entirely fade. The restaurant was everything they had envisioned: warm, welcoming, and bustling with energy. Servers like Jenny moved through the dining room with confidence and genuine enthusiasm, supported by kitchen staff who took pride in their craft, and front-of-house employees who saw their work as meaningful rather than just a job. The first month's numbers exceeded all projections, with strong sales, excellent reviews, and most importantly, high employee satisfaction scores. Sophie found herself featured in local business publications, profiled as an example of unconventional leadership and innovative management practices. But the true measure of success came 3 months after opening, when Sophie received a text from Jenny. "Thank you for seeing something in me that I didn't see in myself. This job is changing my life." Similar messages arrived from other staff members, from customers who appreciated the restaurant's community focus, and from industry colleagues who were implementing their own versions of the Common Ground model. 6 months after opening, Sophie received a call from Catherine Mills with news that would have seemed impossible a year earlier. The Common Ground model is being adopted by 3 other Winters Restaurant Group locations. And we've had acquisition offers from 2 competitors who want to license the concept. Your equity stake just became worth approximately $2.3 million. End quote. Sophie sat in her new apartment, larger and brighter than her old place, but still modest by Portland standards, trying to process the information. She had become a millionaire through a combination of courage, hard work, and an extraordinary opportunity created by standing up for someone who needed protection. The story came full circle the following month when Sophie was having lunch at a competing restaurant and overheard a server being berated by a difficult customer. Without hesitation, she approached the table and offered to help resolve the situation, drawing on her experience and authority as a successful restaurant owner to diffuse the conflict. Later, she arranged for the server to interview at common ground, continuing a cycle of protection and opportunity that had started with her own willingness to sacrifice personal security for principle. The transformation from struggling waitress to millionaire restaurant owner had taken less than 2 years, but the values that made it possible had been present all along. Sophie had simply needed someone to recognize their worth and create space for them to flourish. As she reflected on the journey during the restaurant's first anniversary celebration, surrounded by staff who had become family and customers who had become community, Sophie realized that the most important change wasn't in her bank account or business title. It was in her understanding of what became possible when people chose courage over comfort, when they prioritized principles over personal advancement, and when they created systems that elevated everyone rather than just themselves. The man who had seemed like her worst nightmare had become the catalyst for her greatest opportunity, proof that sometimes the most difficult moments contain the seeds of extraordinary transformation. Jenny Rodriguez, now the assistant manager at Common Ground and enrolled in business school, raised a toast to Sophie during the anniversary celebration. To someone who showed me that standing up for others isn't just the right thing to do, it's the smart thing to do. And to a restaurant that proves you can be successful and decent at the same time. Sophie raised her glass in response, looking around at the bustling dining room filled with employees who earned living wages, customers who felt welcomed and valued, and an atmosphere that honored both profit and principle. The scared, angry waitress, who had defended a teenage girl in tears, had evolved into a confident business leader, but the core values remained unchanged. Sometimes, doing the right thing cost everything. And sometimes, it led to everything you never knew you wanted. Alexander Winters approached Sophie near the end of the anniversary celebration, carrying 2 cups of the restaurant's signature coffee and wearing the satisfied expression of someone whose investment had exceeded all boss expectations. "I have a proposition for you," he said, echoing the words that had changed Sophie's life 2 years earlier. "I'm listening," she replied, echoing her own response from that uncertain afternoon at the Heathman Hotel. "We're expanding the Common Ground concept nationally. 20 locations over the next 5 years, each managed by someone who shares our values and has demonstrated leadership under pressure. I want you to oversee the expansion as Regional Director of Operations, with equity stakes in every location." Sophie looked around at the restaurant she had built, at the community she had created, and at the future she had never imagined possible. The scared young woman who had stood up to a difficult customer had become someone capable of changing an entire industry. "When do we start?" she asked. The partnership that had begun with conflict and courage was ready for its next chapter, proof that sometimes the most unlikely encounters create the most extraordinary opportunities. Sophie Martinez had learned that standing up for others was not just morally right, but practically smart. That character under pressure was the most valuable currency in business, and that the distance between struggling and thriving could be crossed by someone willing to do what was right, regardless of the cost. Her story became legend in Portland's restaurant community, told and retold as proof that integrity was not incompatible with success, that treating people well was not a luxury, but a necessity, and that sometimes the customers who seemed most difficult were actually offering the greatest opportunities for growth. The waitress who got fired for arguing with a customer had indeed become a millionaire, but more importantly, she had become the kind of leader who created millionaires out of others, transforming an industry one restaurant, one employee, and one act of courage at a time. In the end, Sophie's greatest achievement was not her personal wealth, but her proof that doing the right thing, even at great personal cost, often led to outcomes more extraordinary than anyone could have planned or predicted. The courage to stand up for others had become the foundation for building something that would stand up for generations to come.